Many have seen similar footage from European capitals: Brussels, London, Berlin, Paris. How did this become possible? Why are Eastern European and Asian countries now safer and cleaner than Central Western Europe? This question has a centuries-old history, with well-defined causes and consequences, and its own ideologists, executors, and beneficiaries who are usually not mentioned at all. In this major documentary film, we will piece together the puzzle from several factors: colonialism in the past, reverse migration to the metropolises, and the imposed woke culture, aggressive ideologies destroying European societies. And of course, we will talk about the hidden forces that drive these processes. The biggest migration crisis in Europe since World War II has become the litmus test for these problems. The starting point is the year 2015. Streams of people, mainly from Syria, Afghanistan, and Iraq, countries engulfed in war and instability, rushed to Europe by any means possible, most often bypassing official channels, and, naturally, without the proper documents. The main route became the dangerous sea journey across the Mediterranean from the North African coasts of Libya, Tunisia, and Algeria toward Italy, Greece, and Malta. The crossing was organized by criminal smuggling networks. Migrants paid between 2.5 and 3.8 thousand euros for a spot on overloaded fishing boats or inflatable vessels not designed for long-distance travel. This route was not only illegal, but also deadly dangerous. The boats often sank in open waters at the first sign of bad weather, causing dozens or even hundreds of deaths. Some died even before arrival from dehydration and overheating. According to United Nations figures, from 2015 to 2020, 17,000 people died or went missing on this route. Despite this, thousands of illegal migrants still continue to choose this route. The main guide within Europe itself was Angela Merkel, who was in power in Germany. I'll be brief. Germany is a strong country. We can handle this. Without consulting the parliament, she made the decision to open Germany's borders to all Syrian refugees, regardless of which European Union country they first crossed the border in. Thus, Germany became the first European Union country to violate the provisions of the Dublin Convention. According to the 1990 agreement, an asylum application must be submitted in the first safe country of entry, and, accordingly, the first country to take the brunt of migration with all its consequences. This initiative instantly caused an avalanche effect. In 2015 alone, more than 442,000 refugees from Middle Eastern countries were officially registered in Germany. Migrants were coming in via forest and mountain roads between Austria and German Bavaria, and border police couldn't handle the large flow. Overall, throughout the European Union that year, more than 1.2 million people applied for asylum. But the real number was probably much higher. Thousands of migrants chose not to apply for status, instead staying in Europe as illegal residents. Two problems arose. First, there was an urgent need to address how to accommodate the arrivals. Second, European Union countries were forced to increase patrols in the Mediterranean Sea to save migrants illegally crossing maritime borders from perishing in the waves. At first, European politicians enthusiastically decided that each European Union country should accept a certain number of refugees, but opinions differed on the actual number. Meanwhile, as politicians in stuffy offices tried to reach an agreement, migrants continued to pour into Europe in an unending stream. A divide emerged in the European Union when the Czech Republic, Hungary, Romania, and Slovakia refused to accept more refugees. The situation worsened in Western Europe. By early 2016, illegal migrants caused a new problem: increased crime. Native Europeans faced numerous cases of robberies, sexual harassment, and rapes committed by migrants. The most horrific example is the small English town of Rotherham, where this went on for several decades, from the 1980s until 2013. About 1,400 girls aged 11 to 18 became victims of Pakistanis, which is 1 in 6. They were raped and beaten in groups. Some were doused with gasoline and threatened to be burned alive if they tried to escape or seek help. Many victims were forced into sexual slavery. Girls who were raped by Pakistani gangs gave birth to more than 100 babies. Many of them also suffered multiple miscarriages and abortions. The most horrifying thing about this story is that the Rotherham City Council ignored the pleas of raped children and their parents, fearing accusations of racism. The investigator who handled the case accused the council of being involved in the unauthorized removal of information from her office after she sent her report to the city council. When asked why he kept quiet about the crime, the Rotherham Member of Parliament replied, "I didn't want to rock the multicultural boat." And it was only in 2015 that the Casey report was published, a government report that exposed the abuse by the Rotherham City Council, which had been covering up for Pakistani gangs for years. Back in 1968, almost 60 years ago, politician Enoch Powell predicted the consequences of ultra-liberal policies for the foggy Albion. At that time, the press smeared him and labeled him a prophet of doom. In his Rivers of Blood speech, he stated, "Discrimination and deprivation. The sense of anxiety and resentment does not rest on the shoulders of the immigrants, but on the shoulders of those whose land they have come to and to whom they continue to arrive." Here's another vivid example of justice from the United Kingdom. A Pakistani migrant named Muhammad committed 22 crimes, such as home robbery, assaulting a police officer, and raping 3 schoolgirls aged 13 and 16. Sentenced to 15 months in prison with possible parole, Andrew, a native Briton, was a taxi driver, husband, and father. He committed an unbelievable crime. He wrote on social media about migration issues and received 90 months in prison for it. That's 7.5 years without the possibility of parole. And then the terrorist attacks began, which were further hindered from being prevented by European bureaucracy. For example, in the center of the Bavarian city of Ansbach, during a music festival, a Syrian blew himself up. 15 people were injured, and the perpetrator himself died. In a video distributed online, he called himself a member of Islamic State of Iraq and Syria and spoke about the planned terrorist attack. His application for political asylum in Germany was rejected. The Syrian was granted a temporary suspension of deportation, and his deportation to Bulgaria was planned. Europol data. From 2015 to 2020, people from the Middle East and North Africa committed 118 terrorist attacks in European Union countries. 382 people were killed in these attacks. But Angela Merkel still followed a disastrous policy. She insisted that cases of terrorist attacks and assaults should not affect Europe's migration policy, calling them attempts to spread fear and divide society. Merkel convinced her citizens and other nations' leaders to uphold humanitarianism and keep accepting, protecting, and assisting migrants. However, her position was met with strong rejection from some European politicians. Even back then, in 2016, Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban voiced sharp criticism. Hungary's economy can function without any migrants. Whoever needs migrants can take them for themselves, but don't force us. We don't need them. By the way, Orban made an even more candid statement not so long ago. Brussels allowed Europe to be flooded with migrants by opening borders to the migrant influx. George Soros stated that Europe needs to let in 1 million migrants every year, and over the past 9 years, 9 million migrants have arrived in Europe. The migrant invasion of Europe, the population replacement, is not a conspiracy theory, but a reality. Time to find new conspiracy theories, since the old ones all came true. We'll discuss Soros's influence in detail later, but for now, let's return to the migration crisis. The threat of terrorism has further strained native Europeans' finances. If in 2015 the European Union is spending on internal security was about 2 billion euros, by 2019 these expenses had almost doubled. Well, starting from August 2021, another critical moment came for the European Union. The Americans hastily left Afghanistan. Its residents, many of whom worked at American military bases, or even served in the army and supported the pro-American regime inside the country, understandably began seeking refuge in the Western world. The Taliban, who came to power, treated those Afghans who didn't manage to leave the country as harshly as possible. So the flow of Afghans wanting to stay alive only increased. As of the end of August 2021, 2.2 million Afghans were recognized as refugees. The head of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, spoke in favor of reforming the Schengen Agreement regarding migration policy. While working on reforming Schengen, we must find new ways to respond to this aggression and ensure unity and cohesion in protecting our external borders. According to Dr. Nader Talebi from the Berlin Institute for Migration Research, such statements seem rather strange. Since military contingents from European Union countries participated in the Afghan military campaign, shouldn't European politicians know that in this way they contributed to the crisis in Afghanistan? It doesn't matter that people are dying in Yemen and Sudan. As long as it doesn't concern European borders, it doesn't exist, said Dr. Talebi. All the recent major waves of migration to the European Union have come from Muslim countries. European politicians' eloquent speeches about freedom and equality were sincere, with no hidden catch. In reality, most European Union countries are Christian, comprising 73% of the European Union's population. The clashes between Christian and Islamic ways of life and moral values have led to catastrophic results. The spread of radical Islam and crimes based on religion have resulted in one outcome: a rise in xenophobia. People in Western countries are showing more aggression toward migrants. Another result was the division of European Union countries over migration policy. The ultra-liberal policy of major European countries has created a paradox. They must uphold liberal values while also protecting their own citizens. These two desires have created a tangled mess in which both goals have become unattainable. It may seem that migration problems are connected to specific events of recent decades, but that's far from the case. Next chapter will explain why. Colonial boomerang. About 10% of France's population are immigrants, not just recent arrivals like Syrians or Afghans, but generations who have grown up there. Among these 10%, the largest nationalities are Algerians, 713,000 people, and Moroccans, 653,000. This shows Africa's colonization map at its most divided in the 20th century. France's colonies, including Algeria and Morocco, are marked in blue. See for yourself. This isn't a coincidence. Statistics for the United Kingdom. Immigrants make up 13%, with the main groups being from India and Pakistan. A map of a different region. The meaning remains. Spain is the largest donor of immigrants. Morocco, Belgium, Morocco, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and so on. Let's delve into history. America was the first great trophy of European expansion. To the conquerors, a continent with ancient civilizations like the Aztecs, Incas, and Maya suddenly seemed like a blank canvas. The conquistadors brought the cross and sword, the gospel and gunpowder. Often, one led to the other. Cities were burning, temples were collapsing, and the local gods were either overthrown or banned. At the same time, silver and gold from Bolivia, cocoa from Mexico, and Caribbean tobacco poured into Europe. It was more than enrichment. It was a structural reboot of Europe. Spain and Portugal turned into world powers, while England and France were biding their time. The paradox is that colonization transformed both the conquered lands and Europe itself. A simple English farmer raising sheep was soon drinking tea from Ceylon and smoking tobacco grown by the hands of an African slave in Virginia. Though the term globalization didn't exist then, these were its early steps. The nuance was that the fruits of globalization were not available to everyone. Asia is not just a continent, but an ancient civilization, and that's why Europeans had to act more delicately here. There was no complete conquest here, like in America, but there was no full equality either. In India, the British integrated the Indian elite into their governance, but only in subordinate roles. This was colonialism disguised as bureaucracy and accounting. In China, Japan, Vietnam, and Indonesia, the methods differed everywhere, but the essence remained the same. Europe took resources, markets, and influence, and asserted itself through technical, economic, and racial superiority. But Asia learned to respond. Nationalist movements of the century were born not on the outskirts, but within the system, at the intersection of tradition and modernity, Confucianism and Marxism. Colonization in Asia was destined to fail from the start. Africa was long bypassed as Europeans mostly traded along the coast, especially with North Africa. But in the era when the first ships and the telegraph connected the continents, Europe wanted more. The so-called scramble for Africa began when almost the entire continent was divided up with a ruler between the metropolises. Tribes and peoples who spoke different languages and had different traditions suddenly found themselves in the same colony, governed from London, Paris, and Brussels. For centuries, colonial rule oppressed Africa and drove the continent further into backwardness, effectively keeping local society not even at a feudal, but at a tribal level of development. It all began at the end of the century, and there were several reasons for that. Europe discovered the properties of quinine, produced from the bark of the South American cinchona tree, which could cure malaria, making the disease no longer so frightening for European settlers. Europe developed rifled weapon technology, which had huge advantages over the smoothbore musket that even the most advanced African armies were equipped with. Europe gathered enough information about the interior of Africa thanks to a whole cohort of renowned explorers who successfully made their way through jungles, swamps, and deserts, proving that the sun there does not burn a person alive, as ancient authors once believed. Finally, Europe went through the Industrial Revolution and was in urgent need of new markets for factory goods, which were being produced at an unprecedented speed and in large quantities. To start the colonial race, all that was needed was the first shot. It was destined not to be fired by the great powers, but by Little Belgium. That shot was fired in 1876 in Brussels, when the Belgian King Leopold announced the creation of the International African Association to promote scientific and humanitarian projects in the Congo River Basin. All across Europe, this step was seen as the beginning of the Belgian conquest of Central Africa. And that's exactly what it was. The Belgian Congo became a tragic symbol of that era. There was no parliament, court, or school here, only rubber for world industry. People worked under threat of the whip and lost hands if quotas weren't met. Meanwhile, Europe was receiving money to build palaces and universities. The exploitation of the local population on Belgian-organized rubber plantations, in mines, and in road construction was so harsh that nothing like it had ever been seen before in African history. People were dying by the tens of thousands, and at the same time, the repression and looting remained unchecked. Because the Congo Free State, as this vast territory was cynically called, was not governed by the Belgian state, but was the personal property of Leopold. England, France, Portugal, and Spain immediately followed Belgium. A little later, the young great powers of Germany and Italy, who also dreamed of their own colonial empires, joined in the division of the suddenly fashionable African pie. The race gained hurricane speed. Everywhere in Africa, where it was possible to reach an agreement with tribal chiefs or break the resistance of local principalities, a European flag was immediately raised, and the territory was considered annexed to the empire. It can't be said that this lightning-fast division of the continent came without losses for the colonizers. The English had to go through several bloody battles to capture the Ashanti Confederation in Ghana and the Ulus State in South Africa, while the French overcame desperate resistance from the Emirates in Fulbe and the Tuaregs in Mali. For 2 years, German troops had to suppress the Herero uprising in Namibia, which ended in a large-scale genocide of Africans. In more than 3 centuries of the slave trade, Europeans inflicted enormous damage on Africa. Millions of Africans were transported to work on American plantations or died during capture and transportation. Europeans were more likely to colonize parts of Africa, Eurasia, and the Americas, where the local population was more easily intoxicated. European colonizers brought alcohol with them, which was a very profitable commodity, with profits ranging from 400 to 900%. They sold it to the New World in exchange for almost everything, from wood to slaves. In West Africa, alcohol, especially rum, became an integral part of the Golden Triangle, that is, the trade scheme: rum from America, slaves from Africa, and sugarcane from the West Indies. Although by 1900 the African continent had turned into something like a patchwork quilt, colored with the colors of European empires. Tanganyika, the territory of present-day Tanzania, was only brought under German control in 1907, and France secured control over West Africa no earlier than 1913. The liberation struggle of the Libyan tribes against the Italians continued until 1922, and the Spanish managed to pacify the warlike Berbers of Morocco only in 1926. Only one state managed to preserve its independence, the one created by Africans, Ethiopia. At the end of the century, the Ethiopian Negus Menelik even managed to take part in the partition of Africa, more than doubling the borders of his state at the expense of various tribes. In the south, west, and east, the colonizers did build some elements of a modern economy in Africa. However, its scale remained extremely small compared to the scale of the traditional economy. They ended internal wars and wiped out cannibalism, which had thrived in the continent's center. They built several schools and hospitals and sent some Africans to universities. However, they did not make the colony's populations civilized or independent. Africans were taught to obey white masters, but this did not turn a savage into a civilized person or a former slave into a free man. By the end of the colonial period, there were very few educated people and qualified specialists in Africa. Most importantly, neither the elites nor the masses were used to making decisions, considering consequences, or taking responsibility. Even in colonial darkness, future forms emerged. Africans in colonial administrations or the army began to understand metropolitan worlds, adopting their language, ideas, and revolutionary slogans. The colony became not only an object, but also a kind of mirror in which Europe saw its own fears, greed, and double standards. Colonization provided Europe with raw materials and helped it become the world's center. Resources such as rubber, sugar, cotton, tea, oil, and labor in the form of millions of slaves flowed through the colonies. In addition, the colonies became an excellent sales market. Here, Europeans sold their products at inflated prices. There was also cultural influence. French in Algeria, English in India, Catholic missions in the Congo, and more. European influence is most evident in the language. Listing all the countries would take too long, so the results are on your screen. English performed the best. Not surprising for the largest empire in human history. At the start of the 20th century, the British Empire peaked, about 35.5 million square kilometers. That's roughly a quarter of all the land on Earth. It had a population of over 450 million people, which was about a quarter of the world's population at that time. And the worst-performing colonial language was German. That's not surprising either, since the Germans were the last to join the colonial movement. Today, German is spoken in former colonies only in Namibia and by a small portion of the population. As a result, Europe built a system of global inequality, where it was the source of meaning, law, and knowledge, while the colonies were objects of education, discipline, and extraction. Another historical fact: colonization partly gave Europe time for industrialization, scientific progress, and capital accumulation. When the colonies collapsed, Europe had already advanced to a new evolutionary stage for the state. From empire to nation-state, then economic unions. But history isn't a monologue or a one-way street. A well-made boomerang is sure to come back and hit you in the forehead. Europe sent soldiers, priests, and merchants to the colonies, but then the colonies came to Europe. After World War II, when the colonial empires collapsed, millions of former subjects began coming to the metropolis, looking for work, escaping poverty, and trying to recover from colonial trauma. France would not have been able to rebuild its economy without Algerians and Senegalese, and Britain would not have been able to cope with the labor shortage without Indians, Pakistanis, and Jamaicans. Germany, though not a colonial power, welcomed Turks and Yugoslavs at the same scale. Colonization led to a reverse flow from the periphery to the center. This wasn't just migration, but an unequal repayment, as former colonies tried to integrate into the center that once defined their borders. Language and gods. Today in London you can hear Urdu, in Paris Arabic and Berber, in Brussels Swahili. Colonization changed the face of Europe. It made it multilingual, multicultural, and, as a result, internally conflicted. Europe created a world where it has now become a part of it, not its pinnacle. A colony is not just a territory. It's a process that, once started, can no longer be reversed. In the 20th century, Europe lost its colonies but entered a new era, with fading borders and lingering old wounds. During migration crises, cultural tensions, and identity struggles. But there is another important topic: aggressive ideology. That's how it happens in history. What begins as a pursuit of justice often ends with legal bans, fear of speaking, and cultural paralysis. This is what woke culture is, a phenomenon born at the intersection of the American civil rights movement, European philosophical theory, and digital moralizing. As a result, history was rewritten, people became afraid to say anything about minorities, and European societies were slowly restructured. Now, the one who can prove they are the biggest victim is considered right. All of this has penetrated European state institutions and empowered people who do not represent the mainstream of society. Interestingly, the roots of woke culture lie in European philosophical books. But once these ideas reached the United States, it was there that they found their embodiment and support. Only then did they bounce back across the Atlantic like a trampoline to Europe and take root in the European Union. The founders were the French philosophers Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida. Michel Foucault viewed power not as something concentrated in one place, for example, with a monarch or the state, but as a network structure permeating all levels of society: language, medicine, sexuality, education. He argued that what is considered the norm is a product of power, established through discourse, that is, through the way we speak and think. These ideas formed the basis of modern criticism of structural racism, patriarchy, hegemonic language, the idea that even language and everyday norms are tools of oppression. Another philosopher, Jacques Derrida, introduced the idea of deconstruction, a method of breaking down culture into layers to reveal hidden hierarchies, privileges, and biases. Today, this approach is used to rethink and rewrite history. Later, based on these ideas, American post-colonial studies emerged, followed by critical race theory, where the Foucauldian model of power became the foundation for political and cultural demands. In the second half of the century, these complex philosophical ideas made their way into American campuses, then into mass media activism, and finally into digital culture. Philosophical theories became slogans, doubts turned into dogmas, and criticism became a new moral authority. Well, the very woke idea itself turned from a theory about goodness and justice into an aggressive ideology and, even worse, into a political tool. This has never happened before. And here we go again. It's fair to say Michel Foucault neither created woke culture nor would approve of its current form. He criticized any forms of dogmatism, but it was his approach to power, language, and norms that became the philosophical foundation for the later ideologies that gave rise to the woke movement. The word woke itself means awakened to injustice in English. In the United States, this word was originally part of the vocabulary of African American activists. It meant being aware of racism, economic inequality, and discrimination. In the 21st century, social media, university campaigns, and a left-wing intellectual climate changed the term. The word woke came to mean a worldview where social justice is placed above facts and feelings above logic. And when this impulse crossed the Atlantic, Europe adopted it not as an experience, but as a directive, without context, without doubt, as a new moral religion. For centuries, Europe was home to philosophers, writers, and thinkers who argued and rebelled. Enlightenment, individualism, and human rights emerged here. But with woke culture, words, once expressions of thought, became dangerous. A journalist can be fired for using an inaccurate gender term. A teacher can be subjected to a harassment campaign for quoting Shakespeare or Swift. A German artist can be accused of racism if someone sees their installation as cultural appropriation, even if it was meant as a gesture of respect. In France, a University of Lyon professor was publicly condemned for criticizing the division of literature by ethnicity in a lecture. In the United Kingdom, Cambridge students suggested canceling Homer and Dante for their patriarchal views and colonial mentality. Satire, irony, and historical reconstruction have all come under suspicion. A creative person is forced to think not about the truth, but about whether they might offend a sensitive audience, who often haven't read the actual text, listened to the music, or watched the film. But even more dangerous is how woke culture deals with the past. European history is complex, tragic, and bloody, but instead of trying to understand it, activists start erasing and reshaping it. In Belgium, the monument to King Leopold was defaced and partially dismantled not through dialogue, but under pressure from the crowd. Statues of Churchill in the United Kingdom are now being installed with security due to potential protests. After repeated vandalism of the monument, there was a debate in Amsterdam about decolonizing Rembrandt, as if the light and shadow in his paintings could be seen as political constructs. Under the slogans of inclusivity, a new form of division by skin color, gender, and sexuality is increasingly apparent. In some universities in Sweden and France, white zones and spaces for non-white students are already being introduced under the pretext of emotional safety. But this is, in fact, the same old segregation that people tried to overcome in the 20th century.
Among the students of 72 English schools, there is not a single white Englishman. In another 454 schools, white children make up less than 2% of the total number of students. In every fourth school, white children have become a minority. The newspaper citing the Ministry of Education reports these figures. I am firmly convinced that all of this is being done deliberately, purposefully, and on a national scale. What kind of assimilation of newcomers and what kind of mutual cultural enrichment can we even talk about when thousands of our children are being raised in classrooms where white English kids are present? That's more the exception than the rule. Just try saying this out loud. The current authorities can easily label you a potential terrorist for this. I'm not exaggerating at all.
White Britons will become a minority in the United Kingdom by 2063. Foreigners born outside the United Kingdom and their immediate descendants will become the majority around 2079. And by the end of this century, about 1/4 of all people in the country will be followers of Islam and will be Muslims. This country now seems to be set to experience a level of demographic change, cultural change, and religious change that I think is unprecedented in its history. Those who previously called for equality are now demanding privileges, but in the opposite direction. The white majority is often labeled as oppressors, regardless of individual experience. Migrants are viewed not as individuals, but as victims, while Europeans are seen not as citizens, but as inheritors of colonial oppression. European institutions, from schools to corporations, are increasingly adopting sensitive speech codes, introducing diversity officers, and requiring employees to undergo unconscious bias training. In Denmark, teachers must now consider racial contexts when analyzing fairy tales. German officials must use gender-neutral language in documents, sometimes to an extreme. Use Bürgerinnen instead of Bürgercitizen to include everyone, including non-binary people. This hasn't made society kinder or fairer. Instead, it has made people more wary and paralyzed. Language stops being a means of communication. It becomes a minefield you have to cross without a metal detector. People are afraid to joke, to remember, to express doubts. But let's ask ourselves, is all of this really a natural historical process? It's clear that for the general public, the migration crisis is something spontaneous and at the same time taken for granted. But maybe there are hidden forces that help set this global historical mechanism in motion. Maybe there are specific individuals, ideologists, executors, and beneficiaries of this whole system. Here, of course, we are treading on the shaky ground of conspiracy theories, and what you are about to see may change your attitude toward all of this, not as a theory, but as the very real practice of conspiracy. Let's start with this character, whom Hungarian Prime Minister Orbán spoke about. Billionaire, benefactor, and philanthropist George Soros. Who is he? An officer of the world backstage or Dr. Evil? How did they end up together? In this photo, Bill Gates' father, Ted Turner, Rockefeller, and Soros, like a jack-in-the-box, he constantly appears at the epicenter of the most extreme events. Despite his active charity work and declarations of a world without borders, in the countries where he did good and caused irreparable benefit with his activities, he is a persona non grata. In 2003, his foundation was closed in Russia. In Ukraine, he was hit with mayonnaise and rotten eggs. In Georgia, a coffin with his dummy was paraded. In Hungary, he was declared completely outlawed. In October 2018, there was an assassination attempt on Soros. A homemade explosive device was placed in his mailbox. This act put all the dots on the I's and became the final assessment of his activities around the world. Meanwhile, the first global scam happened recently. On September 16, 1992, the pound sterling's exchange rate collapsed. The Bank of England was forced to withdraw it from the European exchange rate mechanism, which led to an instant devaluation of the pound against major currencies. This day became known as Black Wednesday in England's history, while George Soros proudly called it White Wednesday. On that day, he was able to make a profit equal to $1 billion. The story goes like this. In 1970, Soros, together with Jim Rogers, founded the famous quantum hedge fund, which became one of his main sources of income. By buying British currency in small batches over several years, he, through the quantum fund, suddenly sold about £5 billion at once, sharply dropping the exchange rate to a critical minimum. Soros made $1 billion profit from buying back devalued pounds, earning the title, "The Man Who Broke the Bank of England." Although, of course, this is not solely the achievement of the evil financial genius, it's just that within his shadowy power group, he was the most public and rather brazen figure. But more on that a bit later. George Potroshitel's next achievement was the Asian financial crisis, which set off global stock market disasters, including Russia's default and the United States .com crash. It all started in the summer of 1997, when Soros bet more than $1 billion, about 1/10 of all his financial resources, on the fall of the Thai baht, and the baht collapsed. A chain reaction occurred, affecting all of East Asia from Korea to Indonesia. Soros also contributed to the fall of the Malaysian ringgit. That was when the first accusations against Soros arose, alleging not only investment vulture behavior, but also political motives. Officials openly spoke out against Soros, including the Prime Minister of Malaysia, Mahathir Mohamad. He stated that Soros crashed the currencies of Malaysia and Thailand with the specific political goal of punishing these countries for accepting Myanmar, which was uncooperative with the international financial community, into the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. A similar situation occurred in Brazil in 1998. Nobel laureate Paul Krugman accused Soros of colluding with Brazil's future central bank chairman. Krugman said Soros used insider knowledge of financial policy to buy Brazil's debt obligations. Subsequently, however, under pressure, Krugman was forced to withdraw his accusations, but overall he did not abandon his extremely negative assessment of the activities of the infernal magnate. A brief biography is needed to fully understand this figure. George Soros was born on August 12, 1930 in Budapest, and was given the name Dirk Schwartz at birth. 6 years later, his father, a well-known lawyer and prominent figure in the Jewish community, changed his and his family's surname to the Hungarian Soros. The boy showed mathematical abilities from an early age. In March 1944, when Hitler brought troops into the country and began sending Hungarian Jews to concentration camps, the future billionaire's father managed to obtain fake documents for himself, his wife, and his 2 sons, and then began selling forged passports to his fellow countrymen. George Soros briefly assumed the name Shandor Kish. At 14, he hid with a Ministry of Agriculture official, who claimed Soros was his grandson during the war. Later, this same ministry official was tasked with inventorying the property of Jews sent to the concentration camp. And his fake grandson actively helped him with this. He took a direct part in compiling the lists of those who were sent to the camps. Soros himself does not deny this fact from his biography. He answers simply, "If I hadn't done it, someone else would have."
For 2 years, you've been blamed for financial crises in Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, Japan, and Russia. All of the above? All of the above. Are you really that influential? I've been accused of all sorts of things. I'm just making money there. I can't and won't look at the social consequences of what I do. I'm trying to do the right thing, but sometimes my actions lead to negative consequences. Like in Russia, as a market player, I must compete to win. As a person, I care about the society I live in. Which George Soros am I speaking to now? The moral one or the immoral one? It's one person who occasionally does immoral things and the rest of the time tries to be moral. Whether it's me or someone else doing the same thing at the market, the end result will be no different. I don't feel guilty because I'm involved in an immoral activity where there's no place for guilt. You are a Hungarian Jew who survived the Holocaust by pretending to be a Christian. Is that right? As far as I know, you went together with your patron, who swore that you were his adopted godson. You went to confiscate property from the Jews? That's correct. Was it difficult? No. Not at all. No guilt at all. No. Actually, it's ironic, but it's the same as with the markets. If I hadn't been there, of course, I wouldn't have taken anything away. It would have happened anyway. Whether I was there or not doesn't matter. Even if just as a witness, this property would have been taken away. I did not take any direct part in the confiscation of this property, so I do not feel guilty.
In 1947, former Sandor Kish became Durdam Soros again, left Hungary, and went to London to stay with relatives. In London, Derd Soros changes to George Soros, and he receives higher education at the School of Economics, which he graduates from in 1952. Here, he becomes close with one of the professors, Karl Popper, whose idea of creating an open society becomes the life credo of the future billionaire. In his book, The Open Society and Its Enemies, published in 1945, Popper wrote, "The effectiveness of democracy largely depends on citizens' understanding that a government which tries to abuse its power and become a tyranny thereby puts itself outside the law. It's not just citizens' right, but their duty to view such a government's actions as criminal and its members as a dangerous gang of criminals." George Soros turned out to be a talented student and realized that the above-mentioned understanding could be instilled in citizens through controlled media and organizations disguised as independent and charitable foundations. After the ideologically prepared society overthrows the old government, it will be possible to form a new one that will act in the interests of the one who organized all of this. Unlike Karl Popper, who was a pure theorist, George Soros managed to apply his knowledge in practice in several countries. His Quantum Group Fund is considered the second largest charitable foundation in the United States after the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. The result of this charitable activity was George Potroshitel's interference in the internal affairs of other countries in order to influence their domestic and foreign policy. One of these countries is Russia. During the collapse of the Soviet Union, George Soros took the most active position. He participated in promoting Boris Yeltsin for the presidency of Russia, sponsoring his election campaign. He is also closely connected with several new-type politicians, including Nemtsov, Yavlinsky, and others. His close ties to the president let him meddle in state affairs. In the 90s, together with Vladimir Potanin, he acquires a part of the Russian state telephone holding company Svyazinvest as private property and becomes the owner of 25% of the shares of this enterprise. He buys up brains and scientific ideas, giving Russian science a disservice through international grants. In 1996, Soros set up internet centers in 33 Russian universities and covered traffic and maintenance costs. It was a nice gesture, but it led to a brain drain, with about 100,000 scientists leaving Russia. No one was forced into the trunk. They were just promised a better life. In the turbulent 90s, it seemed nobody cared about scientists. But in 1995, the director of the Federal Counterintelligence Service, Stepashin, gave a report in which he accused Soros of espionage and undermining the national security of the state. Soros's activities are gradually winding down. He is barred from buying the NTV channel, and in 2003 his branch is closed for alleged tax evasion. Soros, or as he is sometimes called, the Black Demiurge, declares Russia his enemy. At the same time, Soros is working on Serbia. In 1989, he begins to finance the company B92, which owns television, radio, and internet resources. It is the primary promoter of American NATO values and coordinates related parties' actions. Later, it will play an important role in the bulldozer revolution organized by George Soros in the year 2000. During the presidential elections, activists from the youth organization Otpor, created by George Soros, tried to seize the parliament building by throwing tear gas grenades at the police, and then broke through the police cordon with the help of a bulldozer. 3 years later, Georgia saw a similar event to the bulldozer revolution, called the Rose Revolution. There too, even before the elections, a youth organization called Kamara Enough was created by George Soros. Kamara activists visited Belgrade to learn about overthrowing the president, while Otpor activists traveled to Tbilisi to train future insurgents. Mikhail Saakashvili, the future revolutionary leader, visited Belgrade to study their experience. Moreover, it is documented that all these trips were paid for by George Soros. For the third time, George Soros tried to organize a coup in Ukraine, which became known as the Orange Revolution. Here, under the pretext of public outrage over the results of the 2004 presidential election, he financed the anti-government protest of the Molodoy Rukh organization and later the Maidan. Another example of his interference is the Tulip Revolution in Kyrgyzstan and his active participation in the political struggle to overthrow the country's prime minister, Viktor Orban, in his homeland, Hungary. The conflict started in 2015 over mass refugee migration to Europe, which Orban strongly opposed. The government accused Soros of meddling in the country's internal affairs, including educational institutions in Hungary, especially Central European University in Budapest. Like in other countries affected by Soros's philanthropy, he is unwelcome in Hungary. Who is behind the revolution generator? Let's start with the fact that George Soros is a member of the Bilderberg Club, which probably every second person on the planet already knows about. But Soros wouldn't be Soros if he didn't try to create his own super club with blackjack and economists. In November 2009, during the global financial crisis, this billionaire announced plans for the new Bretton Woods Conference. In April 2011, Soros held this conference. There aren't many details about it. Soros spent $50 million to bring together about 200 scholars, business people, and government leaders in New Hampshire, under the auspices of his Institute for New Economic Thinking. The meeting included such celebrities as former chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, Paul Volcker, former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Gordon Brown, Nobel laureate, and former Vice President of the World Bank, Joseph Stiglitz. Jeffrey Sachs, famed economist and Earth Institute director. Soros's event in Bretton Woods was just as secretive as a Bilderberg Club meeting. It is known that at the meeting, they discussed the need to move to supranational money and to create a world emission center, or in other words, a world central bank. They also talked about restructuring the global financial system. George Soros is seen as a Rothschild protege and spokesperson in the global backstage table of ranks. Through the public statements and actions of this financial speculator, known for his outrageous behavior, you can get some idea about his masters. The so-called Rothschilds are absolute cosmopolitans. They don't hold on to any statehood, unlike the so-called Rockefellers, who need America, because the United States houses both the printing press and the military-industrial complex that protects it. George Soros openly says that he doesn't like America. No, not because it wages destructive wars worldwide or holds over 2 million people in its prisons. And another 4 or 5 million Americans have been sentenced to prison but are walking free because there aren't enough prisons. And not because in America there is total surveillance of all phone conversations. Soros doesn't like America because it still retains too many attributes of statehood. That's why Soros was one of the main sponsors of Obama during the presidential election campaign. But of course, not for nothing. After all, Soros wouldn't lift a finger unless it promised a profit. Obama was needed for many tasks. But, as an example, we can mention a small family business deal. Among other things, with his environmental acts and restrictive measures, he twisted the arm of the United States coal industry almost to the point of complete bankruptcy. This helped George Soros's brother, Paul Soros, the largest steelmaker in Brazil, to buy cheap coal and coal enterprises, because cheap coal is very important for steel production. And this was made possible by the family business. Well, during the 2016 elections in the United States, George Soros bet billions of dollars on Donald Trump's defeat and suffered a crushing loss. Now, the Trump administration, along with the governments of Europe and Russia, tops his list of enemies and responds to Soros in kind. The billionaire was accused of funding anarchists who disrupted Trump supporters' speeches at the University of California and supporting groups behind mass anti-Trump protests. Early 2017. As a result, the United States joined the countries that declared war on Soros for his anti-national activities. In a world without borders, could George Potroschetel end up completely alone, with no one left to rip apart? One way or another, the activity of this figure is not decreasing yet. Soros supports the rights of oppressed minorities to have abortions, drug legalization, sex education, euthanasia, feminism, and same-sex marriage. He advocates for globalization in all its forms, mass immigration and birth control. Soros promotes these principles around the world through the branch of his Open Society Institute, which operates in 60 countries, with total annual expenditures of about $600 million. Many other veterans of politics, finance, and the media help Soros carry out his propaganda work. Among them is the former president of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, Jacques Attali. It's remarkable how similar Soros's and Attali's ideas are. Both are true cosmopolitans. Both rely on the organizing role of banks. Both talk about the need for a world central bank and world armed forces, and so on. You can sense that they have the same master and patron. And this same person also said in 2010, "In order to establish a new order in the world, we need a serious pandemic." And here's another one of his eloquent quotes. "Marx gave us the idea of a world government, but it will not be the proletariat who implements it, but the bourgeoisie. However, the bourgeoisie will cease to be the bourgeoisie in the process." So, let me introduce him. Jacques Attali, a high-ranking Freemason, advisor to French presidents starting with François Mitterrand, an ideologist of globalism, a politician with a pronounced Zionist leaning, the link between the Élysée Palace and the Parisian Rothschilds, a writer-futurist, and the grey eminence of France. Something like Henry Kissinger in the United States, and earlier in America, that role was held by Bernard Baruch, about whom we have a separate episode with 6 million views, and who also advised several American presidents, beginning with Woodrow Wilson. At the same time, both the grey eminence Jacques Attali and many Rothschilds, including David Rothschild, who headed Rothschild Group, which includes the London, Paris, and Swiss Rothschild banks, are active participants in the Bilderberg Club. In 1991, when the Cold War ended and the Socialist Bloc and the Soviet Union collapsed, the West needed a new international financial institution that would allow it to quickly develop the new economic space. That institution became the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. At that time, Jacques Attali was appointed bank president. Jacques Attali is one of those authors who serve the global oligarchs and periodically voice the plans of the world's behind-the-scenes powers. So the revelations of this writer deserve special attention. Here are a few excerpts from Jacques Attali's book called The Global Economic Crisis. What's next? The main idea of the author of the book, The Global Economic Crisis, is that the current global crisis was caused by serious failures in the functioning of market mechanisms. These failures are due to the fact that markets have become global, while the management of the market economy is still carried out by national states. There is a serious contradiction between democracy and the market. Democracy can exist only within a certain territory, while the market knows no boundaries, whether it's capital, technology, labor, or property. There is no global democracy today, and in fact, there is not even a single unified legal space in almost any area. Global markets, including financial ones, are widespread and rapidly evolving beyond state boundaries, bypassing restrictions and dominating everywhere. What are the two logical solutions for this situation? The first is to return to protectionism and thus dismantle global markets. The second is to urgently work on creating a world government that would bring order to global markets. For Jacques Attali and his associates, the first option is a clear setback for humanity. He believes that if humanity wants progress and democracy, the second option should be chosen. It's hard to convince the reader, so Jacques Attali, a subtle psychologist, often uses anti-capitalist rhetoric. Here are examples of such critical remarks, which, by the way, our professional economists rarely dare to make. Banks are becoming less transparent, keeping most of the profits they make from other people's money. Today, liberal ideology serves a tiny minority. More young professionals are entering real estate, banks, and insurance, while science and engineering work is losing value. We face a pure market that is uncreative, unproductive, and distributes resources unfairly. How can you doubt the author after such bold revelations? The second psychological technique is to reveal the advantage of the second option for solving the problems of modern capitalism: the creation of a world government using positive vocabulary, world democracy, global sovereignty, universal order. This creates the illusion that we are being promised something like advanced communism on a global scale. That very leftward turn toward social justice on a planetary scale. This is a key workplace to ensure the balance between the market and democracy, which is the most important condition for harmonious development on a planetary scale. Tools are needed to implement global sovereignty principles: a parliament, government, a Universal Declaration of Human Rights Annex, and enforcing International Labor Organization labor law decisions. A central bank, shared currency, global tax system, police and justice, pan-European minimum income, and a rating agency, comprehensive financial market oversight. The creation of a world currency that is not tied to any national monetary system is a key point. Jacques Attali also speaks critically about the United States dollar. Not because he is a European advocating for France and the European Union, but because he thinks and acts globally. The American currency has become an obstacle on the path toward a new world order. As a result, the International Monetary Fund should consider creating a world currency modeled after Keynes's Bancor, or a monetary unit that includes the dollar, yen, and euro. One day, they should replace the dollar, whose decline is inevitable. Without it, a return to protectionism is inevitable. A single currency is also important for another reason. You could say for an ideological or even religious reason. It is appropriate here to quote from another book by the same Attali, which is called Jews, the World, and Money. First of all, Attali proudly states that the Jews gave the world two of the most important things: a single God and money. The European people made money unique, a universal tool of exchange, just as they made their God unique, a universal tool of supremacy. The author believes that the prescriptions regarding the behavior of Jews in the world of money, which are contained in the Talmud, are not the result of some higher power, but rather the habits and character of the people who composed the Talmud. The authors of the Talmud themselves were mostly merchants, experts in economics. Any relationships of buying and selling, as well as the pursuit of wealth, in the author's opinion, are quite natural, since they are blessed by God. Esau and Jacob confirm the necessity of gaining wealth in order to please God. God blesses Jacob's wealth and allows him to buy the birthright from his brother Esau. This is proof that everything has a material price, even in the form of a lentil stew. Money, according to Attali, is not only a tool for buying and selling or accumulating wealth, but it is also a means of organizing the most perfect social order. In this cruel world, governed by force, money gradually becomes the highest form of organizing human relations, allowing all conflicts, including religious ones, to be resolved without violence. Money, being a kind of universal tool available to people of any nationality and faith, nevertheless is primarily the possession of Jews, who stand in opposition to the rest of the world. Money is a machine that turns the sacred into the secular, frees from coercion, channels violence, organizes solidarity, helps to resist the demands of non-Jews, and is a wonderful means of serving God. An interesting quote, isn't it? Does Jacques Attali equate the service of Jews to money with their service to God? To support his idea about the spiritual benefit of usury for Jews, Attali cites a quote from a rabbi, Yaakov Tamim. This is an honorable profession. Moneylenders earn money quickly and enough to give up other professions and devote themselves to religious pursuits. But we've gotten sidetracked. Now, here's a quote about how the transition to things like a single currency, a single central bank, a single police force, and a single justice system can hardly be smooth. And such a transition can be accelerated with the help of global upheavals. This won't happen soon. The process will be long and complex, similar to creating the United Nations before World War II. We may have to wait for an even worse war before such reforms are considered seriously. And here's another similar quote. Most likely, nothing or almost nothing of what was proposed will be done, until a catastrophe happens, which, of course, no one wants. No one, especially the United States, will agree to submit to a common supranational decision. It took a millennium of wars for Europeans to come to terms with the very idea of unity. This is the kind of vision of the future from a globalist ideologue, which shows the means by which the masters of money plan to realize this future. But, as they say, for every cunning scheme, there's always some unforeseen factor that throws a wrench in the works. So, let's try to put together the final picture, and each of you can decide for yourself how conspiratorial it is. The masters of money, for whom reproducing colored paper is no problem at all. They direct this paper to various NGOs, NPOs, and charities, which in turn essentially sponsor the departure of Arabs and Africans from their native lands to Europe. Actually, this doesn't just concern Europe, it's a global process. Sometimes it even seems like there is some kind of global plan for certain countries and regions. In the United States, they bring in people from Mexico, in Europe, from Africa, and in Russia, from Central Asia and the Caucasus. And since we're talking about Russia, here's a clear mechanism that puts this plan into action. One that's become all too familiar. The United States Agency for International Development, which Elon Musk recently had a conflict with, had key joint projects with the International Organization for Migration, International Organization for Migration. They were called the Regional Migration Program in Central Asia and Russia, and Safe Migration in Central Asia. Financial support from the World Bank and the British government. And even if one participant in these programs may drop out, others, the British government and the World Bank, are unlikely to reduce their activity. Support for internships, trainings, and seminars for activists still continues. In general, none of this is a secret. Last year, State Duma Deputy Mikhail Matveev publicly revealed documents showing the International Organization for Migration is running programs, not to fill Russia with labor resources and develop the Russian economy, but to help the poor countries of Central Asia.
I brought you this little paper here. This is from the website of the International Organization for Migration. This is from the website of the International Organization for Migration, the International Organization for Migration Russia website. Here, in black and white, there are 4 programs for resettling migrants from Central Asia to Russia. They existed from 2007 to at least 2021. That program in Central Asia is aimed at reducing poverty in Central Asia, not at providing Russia with an economic boost through labor, like they keep telling us here with all their blah, 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 but at reducing poverty. And since the poorest countries are the Kyrgyz Republic and Tajikistan, the main flow comes from there. It is being implemented with the support of the World Bank and the government of the United Kingdom. In your opinion, what does this say? I'll finish now to wrap it up. We open the page on Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, check International Organization for Migration's activities, and see villages and settlements being identified for mobilization. And these kishleks that are being selected, which are supposed to move to Russia, are being chosen in cooperation with the United States Department of State. I didn't make this up. That's the truth. It's a translation from English, but it doesn't matter. So it says that as soon as the group is formed, the village animators facilitate the process of creating a leadership and management system. They set rules, build cooperation among members, and offer ongoing support to maintain unity, solidarity, and problem-solving ability. They appoint a leader and a treasurer and then move to Russia. So it turns out that the United Kingdom government and the World Bank are writing programs for Russia to resettle people here. I'm not reading everything here. It also says that they help us legislatively, they will develop...
State.
They train state and municipal employees of the Russian Migration Service through programs.
To implement such a migration policy in our country, it was necessary to develop tolerance among the population. And this was done for different age groups, with two ideologies. The first one was for the older generation, the ideology of friendship among peoples in the Soviet Union. However, after the collapse, there was no real friendship, or rather, it existed only at the expense of the Russian people. Most Central Asian republics experienced genocide of the Russian population, which still lacks international legal recognition. And for the younger generation, for whom the Soviet experience is not seen as positive, a second ideology was introduced: tolerance and multiculturalism. The world is a big Babylon, and that's great. Just like in the post-war times in old Europe, where it's already time for us to return. Let's take a look at the version from Count Coudenhove-Kalergi. There was such a figure in 20th century history, none other than the founder of the Pan-European Union. He was the first to put forward the idea of a united Europe in the 1920s. He insisted on the complete elimination of borders and the separation of nations from the state. He claimed that there are people of quantity, the masses, and people of quality, the nobility and Jews, as a spiritual aristocracy. He believed that the world should be ruled by a certain noble race, a supranational elite, and that nations and peoples should be mixed to create a single Eurasian Negroid race, which would be led by people of quality. Coudenhove-Kalergi is seen as the spiritual father of Europe and the inspiration for multiculturalism. A medal created in his honor has been awarded to politicians like Angela Merkel, Ronald Reagan, and Helmut Kohl. Who knows, maybe in this kind of conceptual form, the money masters still have this fixed idea stuck in their heads, where the well-being of the people doesn't matter. The main thing is to remain the noble elite at the top of the social pyramid. But where will this elite live? There's little difference. They're citizens of the world. If Europe becomes too criminal and destroyed, they'll move to Latin America, since relocating top Third Reich leaders there has already been done historically. Or are these kinds of theories just pure conspiracy? Much of what's happening reflects the natural evolution of societies, intensified by colonialism's mistakes, resource wars, and new social philosophies. It's clear the world is too complex for anyone to secretly control global social processes. Write what you think about this whole tangle, and see you in the next films on our channel.